In this chapter, you're going to learn the basics of international finance and exchange rates. If you'll remember from the last chapter, we discussed the idea of comparative advantage, the notion that a country has a comparative advantage when it can produce something at a lower opportunity cost. So in this example, while it appears as though Cambodia and France can both produce the same amount of wheat, they give up different amounts of genes in order to produce that wheat. So if I were to ask who has the comparative advantage in wheat, you would have to say Cambodia does, because they give up 10 genes for every 1 bushel of wheat, while France gives up 30 pairs of genes for every 1 bushel of wheat. So Cambodia, while they make their 2,000 bushels of wheat, they give up 20,000 genes. France would have to give up 60,000 genes to produce the same amount of wheat. So Cambodia has the comparative advantage in producing wheat. Who has the comparative advantage in producing genes? Remember, it's not who produces the most, it's who has the lowest opportunity cost, the lowest trade-off. Well, in this case, France has the lowest opportunity cost. If you take 2,000 divided by 60,000, that means that for every gene France makes, they give up 1/30th of a bushel of wheat. Cambodia is going to give up 1/10 of a bushel of wheat for every 1 gene that they make. So according to international trade, if we want to maximize our production, France ought to be producing the genes and Cambodia ought to be producing the wheat, and then they exchange with each other for the things that they need. So if you look around the world, international trade is a vital part of many countries' economies. The areas that are shaded in dark red are those areas in which trade is an extremely important part of their economy. It's a high percentage of their gross domestic product. So you'll notice parts of Africa, parts of Asia, South America, trade is an extremely important part of their economy. So we often look at what's called the balance of payments. Essentially, the balance of payments says that if a country is exporting more than it's importing, it has a trade surplus. That means it's sending to other countries more than it's receiving from other countries. So it's exporting more goods and services than it's importing. It has a trade surplus. On the other hand, if a country is importing more than it's exporting, it has a trade deficit. So in the balance of payments, there are 2 accounts that we look at, and the most common one is called the current account. In the current account, we simply can recognize that the United States has the largest trade deficit. So essentially, this is looking at the value of goods and services that's crossing the borders. And we have a trade deficit. Last year, it was $513 billion. But I will remind you, we have a $21 trillion economy. So while we have a trade deficit, it's not a huge part of our economy. On the other hand, Germany, not China, has the largest trade surplus. Germany exports more goods and services than what it imports. So if you look around the world, the areas that are shaded on this map in browns are areas with a trade surplus. So you'll notice parts of Asia, Russia, even a few countries in Africa and South America have trade surpluses. The areas that are shaded in green are areas that have trade deficits. So you'll notice a lot of the world does have a trade deficit. It's not just the United States. Much of Africa, Asia, even parts of Europe, South America, Central America, Australia, the United States, a lot of countries have trade deficits. So while it appears as though China is a large exporter of goods and services, there are other countries in the world that export more than they import. And so they have a trade surplus versus the areas shaded in green have trade deficits. Now, the other account that we look at is what's called the capital account. The capital account essentially tracks the value of assets that are crossing the borders. So for example, purchases of property, if an individual in another country invests in buying some property in the United States, that's an investment, and that gets tracked in the capital account. If an individual in the United States decides to purchase the share of a stock, which is a company from another country, that gets tracked in the capital account. So the capital account essentially is tracking the flow of investment dollars. And so in 2016, Japan had the largest capital account deficit, extremely large. They were going through a time period in which people in Japan were losing faith in what was happening in their economy. And so there was more investment that was leaving Japan than coming into Japan. On the flip side, the largest capital account surplus was Poland. Interestingly, many countries were recognizing opportunities in Poland for moving factories. Manufacturing greatly increased in 2016 in the country of Poland. So there was a great deal of money that was flowing into Poland, more so than what was leaving Poland. So the current account tracks the value of goods and services. The capital account tracks the value. Ultimately, whenever we have a transaction with another country, we have to exchange our currency. So if I go and I purchase something at the grocery store that was produced in another country, I'm going to pay for it with United States dollars. But somewhere down the line, somebody is going to have to exchange those dollars for the currency of the country where that product was made. So there is this idea of what's called an exchange rate. The exchange rate is simply the price of one country's currency relative to another country's currency. And we think about, why is it that we would even demand other countries' currencies? It's because we want what they're purchasing. So the more we desire the things that those countries are producing, the more we're going to demand their country's currency. We may decide to purchase assets in those countries. In order to buy shares of stock in a British company, we're going to have to somehow exchange US dollars for British pounds. And so these are reasons that we demand another country's currency, and people are supplying their currency for the same reason. I'm willing to supply US dollars when another country desires to purchase things that are produced in the US. We have to supply US dollars and exchange and make that exchange. So an exchange rate, again, is the price of one country's currency relative to the price of another country's currency. So for example, I can say $1 equals 100 Japanese yen. I can also express this looking at it from Japan's perspective. In Japan, they would essentially require a penny in exchange for 1 yen. So in Japan, if they took 1 yen to the foreign exchange market, they would get a penny. If I took $1 to the foreign exchange market, I would get 100 Japanese yen. So think about what this means. There's a factory in Japan that produces a doll, and that doll, they put a price tag of 500 yen on that doll. Well, I decide to buy the doll. It gets imported into the United States, and I decide to purchase the doll. The doll does not have a price of 500 yen. It's been exchanged into US dollars. So in the United States, it would essentially cost $5. So In Japan, the price tag says 500 yen. In the United States, the price tag says $5. So what do we do when the exchange rate fluctuates? Exchange rates, in many cases, many countries, they will fluctuate. And we'll talk about why in just a moment. But let's say the price of a yen goes up from $1 equals 100 yen to $1 only gets you 50 yen. So what that means is the dollar got weaker. We were not able to purchase as many yen as we once were able to with our dollar. What that means is the yen got a lot stronger. So in Japan, you used to only get a penny with your yen. Now you get 2 cents with your yen. We used to get 100 yen for our dollar. Now we only get 50 yen for our dollar. So the dollar got weaker, it depreciated in value, and the yen got stronger, it appreciated in value. So if we look at that doll that cost 500 yen, it now is going to cost me $10 to purchase that doll. So as the dollar gets weaker, the imports into the United States just got more expensive. So as the dollar gets weaker, the imports become more expensive. Now we can also look at the flip side of this. So in the United States, if I produce a doll and put a price tag of $5 on it, over in Japan, it's going to have a price tag that says 500 yen. If the exchange rate changes, then the doll, it still says $5 in the United States, but over in Japan, it says 250 yen. So what that means is the dollar got weaker and the yen got stronger, and our exports just became cheaper. So when the dollar gets weaker and the yen gets stronger, imports into the United States become more expensive, and exports from the United States get cheaper. So oftentimes businesses might choose to prefer a weak dollar simply because they're then able to sell more to other countries because their items are cheaper around the world. This all works in reverse. Also, if the dollar gets stronger, the yen would get weaker. So if the dollar gets stronger, then what that means is imports into the United States become cheaper and exports become more expensive. So consumers in the United States might actually like a strong dollar because the things we import now are cheaper. But businesses don't like a strong dollar because their exports become more expensive. So around the world, these exchange rates oftentimes will float. Essentially what that means is the exchange rate will fluctuate based on the supply and demand of that country's currency. The textbook describes a lot of graphs and the mechanics of how this happens, and I don't want you to get yourself lost in the graphs and the mechanics of this. I just want you to recognize that with a floating exchange rate, the currency price fluctuates based on the supply and demand of that country's currency. Now, the United States has what's called a managed float. Essentially, the United States Federal Reserve has the ability to also manipulate and stabilize those fluctuations. Much of the world has a floating exchange rate of some kind. There's also the idea of what's called a fixed exchange rate. That essentially means that the rate is fixed based on what the government has decided. And what that means is the government is going to have to somehow manipulate the supply and demand of their country's currency in order to keep the price constant. So as the world's supply and demand of that country's currency changes, the government has to step in to make it so that the price stays the same. Again, I don't want you to get lost in the mechanics of how that happens, but I do want you to recognize that around the world, much of the world has either a free or a managed kind of float. There are some fixed exchange around the world, but much of the developed world has some kind of floating or managed float mechanism. So in this chapter, you learned about the basics of international finance by exploring the balance of payments and looking at the current account, the value of goods and services crossing the borders, as well as the capital account, the value of assets that are crossing the borders. And we looked at the mechanics and understanding of exchange rates, and just in understanding that exchange rates will fluctuate. And if the government allows them to fluctuate, it has a float or a managed floating exchange rate. If the government wants to fix its exchange rate, it has to directly intervene into the market to keep the price the same. But when exchange rates change, that has an impact on prices. And so we discovered that if the US dollar becomes weaker, then imports into the United States become more expensive and exports become cheaper. If the US dollar becomes stronger, then imports into the United States become cheaper and exports become more expensive. So this chapter illustrates a little bit of the mechanics of international finance. The next chapter will continue our understanding of international trade by exploring the notion of what are called trade agreements.